If you told me I'd be risking my life for a man like that, I'd have called you a fool. But life has a funny way of testing the things you believe. Darius Walker squinted against the harsh glare of the Mississippi sun as he pulled his truck to the side of the dusty, winding road. He'd seen the car from a distance, its shiny, candy apple red paint job standing out like a sore thumb among the browns and greens of the countryside. Smoke curled lazily from under its hood, and a man sat slumped against the driver's side door. Darius wasn't the kind of man to drive past someone in need. But as he stepped out of his truck and got a better look at the stranded driver, a cold knot of recognition formed in his stomach. It was Hal Carson, the same man who'd made Darius's life a living hell for years. Hal Carson was a fixture in Hollyfield, Mississippi, a small town where everybody knew everybody, and old grudges lingered like the humidity. Hal's reputation preceded him. He came from a long line of Carson men who had ruled the town's social circles and businesses with a sense of entitlement passed down like an heirloom. But more than that, Hal was known for his open disdain for Hollyfield's black residents. For Darius, the memories of Hal's actions were burned into his mind. He'd grown up hearing Hal's insults shouted from the window of his pickup truck, seeing the spray-painted slurs left on the side of his family's barn, and feeling the sting of fists during a misunderstanding at a high school football game. Even now, standing just a few feet away from Hal's broken-down car, those memories threatened to bubble to the surface. Hal's face was pale, his breath shallow. One hand clutched his chest while the other hung limply at his side. The sight made Darius hesitate. He could feel the weight of a choice pressing down on him. Darius could have left Hal there, turned his back and driven away. And maybe that's what Hal would have done if the roles were reversed. But Darius wasn't that kind of man. "Hal," he called out, his voice cautious. Hal's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they were filled with confusion. Then recognition hit, and his face twisted into something between fear and defiance. What are you doing here?" Hal wheezed, his words barely audible. "Looks like you're in trouble," Darius said, his voice steady. "I'm calling for help." "No." Hal rasped, his hand weakly reaching out. "No hospital, can't afford it." Darius stared at him, torn between frustration and pity. "You're having a heart attack, Hal. You don't get to argue about this." Darius wasted no time. He hauled Hal out of the car, careful not to jostle him too much, and laid him in the passenger seat of his own truck. Hal protested weakly, but his words were slurred and incoherent. The drive to Hollyfield's small clinic felt like an eternity. Darius kept glancing at Hal, whose face had turned an alarming shade of gray. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a black man risking his truck, his time, and possibly his safety for someone who'd never shown him an ounce of kindness. When they arrived, the nurses rushed Hal into the emergency room. Darius stayed behind, leaning against the wall of the waiting room, his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He didn't expect gratitude. In fact, he doubted Hal would even remember him. But hours later, when Hal was stable and conscious, the nurse came out with a message that caught Darius off guard. "He's asking for you," she said. Hal's hospital room was dimly lit, the faint beeping of machines filling the silence. Darius stepped inside cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Hal's eyes opened slowly, and when they met Darius's, there was a flicker of something unfamiliar. "Why'd you do it?" Hal asked, his voice raspy but steady. Darius crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "Because it was the right thing to do." Hal scoffed, though it quickly turned into a wince. "Right thing to do, huh? Bet you enjoyed seeing me like that." "I didn't enjoy any of it," Darius said bluntly. "But you needed help. And like it or not, we're both human." Hal didn't respond right away. He stared at the ceiling, his face lined with fatigue and something that looked a lot like regret. "You're a better man than me, Walker," he muttered. Darius raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected any acknowledgement, let alone an admission like that. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness," Darius said, his tone firm. "I did what I had to do. That doesn't erase what you've done." Hal nodded slightly, his eyes closing again. "Fair enough." Word spread quickly in Hollyfield. Darius Walker had saved Hal Carson's life. The reactions were as varied as they were loud. "Better than he deserves," some of the black residents muttered, shaking their heads. "He's braver than most," others said, a note of respect in their voices. Meanwhile, the Carson family wasn't exactly thrilled. Hal's younger brother, Chet, made his opinion known at the local diner. "What's Darius playing at? Think he's gonna get something out of this?" The rumors didn't bother Darius much. He'd done what he believed was right, and that was enough for him. Or so he thought. A week after Hal was discharged, Darius was working on his truck in the driveway when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He looked up to see Hal stepping out of a car, his movements slow and deliberate. Darius wiped his hands on a rag, narrowing his eyes. "Didn't expect to see you here." Hal approached him, his face unreadable. "Didn't expect to be here," he admitted. There was an awkward silence before Hal cleared his throat. "I owe you, for what you did. I don't know how to say thank you, but I'm trying." Darius crossed his arms, leaning back against the truck. "Why now, Hal? You've had plenty of chances to show respect before." Hal looked away, his jaw tightening. Maybe almost dying makes a man think about how he's lived. Darius wasn't ready to let Hal off the hook so easily. He'd spent years living under the shadow of men like him, men who acted as if their power and privilege were unquestionable. "Thinking about how you've lived is one thing," Darius said, his voice steady. "Doing something about it is another." Hal shifted uncomfortably, leaning against the car for support. "I don't expect you to forgive me. Hell, I don't even know if I deserve it. But I can't undo the past, Walker. All I can do is try to be better." Darius studied him for a moment, searching for cracks in the veneer. Hal's words didn't sound rehearsed, but they weren't enough to erase the years of pain he'd caused. "Trying to be better starts with actions," Darius finally said. "Not words. You want to prove something? Start in your own backyard." Hal nodded, his face grim. "Fair enough." He turned to leave, but before he got into his car, he paused. "One more thing. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call me. I owe you that much." Darius didn't respond. He watched Hal drive off, the knot in his stomach tightening. He didn't know if Hal's words meant anything. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. For weeks after the encounter, Darius tried to go about his life as usual. He spent his days repairing fences, fixing tractors, and helping neighbors with odd jobs. But everywhere he went, whispers followed him. "Did you hear Hal Carson went to Darius's house? Can you believe that? Carsons don't apologize to nobody, especially not black folks. What's Hal up to?" Even the black community was divided. Some saw Darius as a hero, a man who'd risen above decades of hate to do the right thing. Others thought he was a fool for helping someone like Hal in the first place. "I'm just saying," Mrs. Hattie from the church murmured one Sunday, "a snake don't stop being a snake just because it sheds its skin." Darius kept his head down, but the weight of the town's scrutiny was hard to ignore. And then, out of the blue, something happened that forced him and Hal to cross paths again. It was late one evening when Darius got the call. The Carson farm was on fire. Flames lit up the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the fields. By the time Darius arrived, half the town was already there, forming a chaotic line to pass buckets of water to the volunteer fire department. Darius spotted Hal near the barn, shouting orders with a desperation that made him look older than his years. Sweat dripped down his face, and his voice was hoarse from yelling. Without hesitation, Darius jumped in, grabbing a bucket and joining the line. It wasn't about Hal. It was about doing what needed to be done. Hours later, when the flames were finally under control, the field was a smoldering ruin. Hal stood at the edge of the ashes, staring at the blackened remains of his crops. Darius approached him, his boots crunching against the charred ground. "You all right?" Hal didn't look at him. "Lost nearly everything." "You've still got the house," Darius pointed out. "And the barn." Hal let out a bitter laugh. "Not much good without the fields, is it?" Darius didn't reply. He knew what it was like to lose something you'd worked your whole life for. The next morning, Darius was back at the Carson farm. This time, he wasn't alone. He'd brought a handful of men from the black side of town, farmers, laborers, and neighbors who knew what it meant to struggle. "What's this?" Hal asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "Help," Darius said simply. Hal blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Why would they help me?" Darius crossed his arms. "Because I asked them to. And because they know what it's like to need a hand." The men set to work, clearing the debris and salvaging what little they could. At first, Hal kept his distance, his pride clearly warring with his gratitude. But as the hours turned into days, something shifted. Hal started working alongside them, not as a Carson, but as a man trying to rebuild his life. And slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. News of what was happening at the Carson farm spread quickly. Some white residents were furious, accusing Hal of stooping too low. "You're letting them make a fool out of you," one of Hal's old drinking buddies spat. But Hal didn't rise to the bait. "They're helping me when no one else would," he said simply. "What's that say about you?" On the other side of town, there was skepticism too. Some questioned why Darius would go out of his way to help a man who'd spent years making their lives harder. "Because we've got to be better than them," Darius explained. "If we want things to change, someone's gotta take the first step." It wasn't easy. There were arguments, misunderstandings, and moments when it felt like the whole thing would fall apart. But as the days turned into weeks, something remarkable happened. For the first time in Hollyfield's history, black and white residents worked side by side. And in the process, they began to see each other not as enemies, but as people. The Carson farm slowly transformed from a wasteland into a working field again. The barn was repaired, the equipment salvaged, and new crops planted. It wasn't easy, there were long days, short tempers, and moments when Hal looked ready to give up. But Darius didn't let him quit. "You want to prove you're a different man?" Darius asked one afternoon, as Hal sat slumped against a fence post, his shirt soaked with sweat. "Then finish what you started. Show the town who you are now, not who you were." Hal didn't respond right away. He stared at the ground, his jaw tight, before finally nodding. Over time, Hal began to shed the arrogance that had defined him for so long. He listened more, worked harder, and treated the men around him with the respect they deserved. One evening, as the group sat around a small fire, eating and resting after a long day, Hal spoke up. "I don't deserve what you've done for me," he said, his voice low but steady. "I spent my whole life thinking I was better than you. And now I see how wrong I was. I'm sorry." The group fell silent. Some looked at Darius, waiting to see how he'd respond. Darius took a long breath, staring into the fire. "Words are a start, Hal. But change takes time. Don't expect anyone to forgive you overnight." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Hal said quietly. "Just a chance to make it right." The sight of black and white men working together on the Carson farm was impossible for the townsfolk to ignore. Some scoffed, muttering about how the world's gone crazy. Others watched with quiet curiosity, unsure of what to make of it. But slowly, the mood in Hollyfield began to change. One day, Earl Watkins, a white farmer who'd kept his distance, showed up with a truckload of supplies. "Figured you could use these," Earl said gruffly, unloading sacks of seed and fertilizer. Least I can do. Hal nodded, his expression sincere. Thank you. From that point on, others began to follow Earl's lead. They brought tools, equipment, and even food for the workers. The Carson farm became a symbol of something Hollyfield had never seen before: cooperation. Through it all, Hal and Darius found themselves talking more. At first, the conversations were brief and guarded. But as the weeks passed, they began to share pieces of their lives. Hal told Darius about growing up in the shadow of his father, a man whose pride and cruelty had shaped him into someone he didn't want to be. Darius spoke about his own father, a kind but stern man who taught him the value of hard work and integrity. You think he'd approve of what you're doing? Hal asked one day, as they repaired a section of fence together. Darius nodded. He always said doing the right thing ain't about what you get out of it. It's about what you leave behind. Hal was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Darius replied. "And I'm trying to be one too." Not everyone in Hollyfield was ready for change. One night, as Darius was locking up his truck after a long day, he found a note pinned to his door. "Stay out of Carson's business, or you'll regret it." Darius stared at the note, his jaw tightening. He knew the risk he was taking by helping Hal. Hollyfield wasn't the kind of place where old prejudices died easily. The next morning, Darius showed the note to Hal. "This is what I get for helping you," Darius said, his voice sharp. Hal's face darkened as he read the note. "I'm sorry, Darius. I didn't." "This isn't about you," Darius interrupted. "It's about this town and the people who'd rather burn it down than see it change." Hal clenched his fists. "We'll find out who did this. I won't let them scare you off." "I'm not scared," Darius said firmly. "But if you want to prove you've changed, Hal, now's your chance to stand up." Hal decided it was time to take a stand. He called for a town meeting, inviting anyone who wanted to come. The gathering took place in the old community hall, a weathered building that had seen its share of arguments and debates over the years. When Hal stepped up to speak, the room fell silent. "I've spent most of my life thinking I was better than a lot of people in this town," Hal began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was wrong. And it took nearly losing everything for me to see that." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Darius Walker saved my life, even though I didn't deserve it. He and his friends rebuilt my farm when no one else would help. And now, I owe them, and this town, something more than words." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others crossed their arms, their expressions skeptical. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Hal continued. "But I'm asking for a chance to make things right. And that starts with all of us working together, not against each other." The meeting didn't change everyone's mind, but it planted a seed. Over the following weeks, more people began showing up at the Carson farm to help. The tension that had once defined Hollyfield began to ease, replaced by cautious optimism. Darius watched it all unfold with a mix of hope and skepticism. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time, it felt like it was possible. One afternoon, as he and Hal stood side by side in the field, Hal turned to him and said, "You think this town will ever really change?" Darius thought for a moment before answering. "Change doesn't come easy. But maybe this is a start." Hal nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then let's make it count." The transformation at the Carson farm became a beacon of change in Hollyfield, but the true impact rippled far beyond its borders. Local newspapers caught wind of the story, a former racist and a black man working together to rebuild not just a farm, but a fractured community. A journalist from Jackson arrived to document the unlikely alliance. The article, titled "Bridges Built in the Fields of Hollyfield," featured photos of Hal and Darius side by side, their hands covered in dirt but their faces proud. The piece went viral, sparking debates and conversations about race, redemption, and reconciliation. Hal wasn't used to being the center of attention for something positive. He received letters from people across the state, some praising his courage, others accusing him of betraying his own. "Don't let it get to you," Darius told him one afternoon, noticing Hal's furrowed brow as he read another letter. "It's not the hate mail that gets to me," Hal admitted. "It's the ones that say they see hope in what we've done. Makes me wonder if I'll ever be able to live up to that." "You already are," Darius replied. "Just keep walking the path." One of the most unexpected outcomes of the farm's revival was the rekindling of old relationships. Hal's brother, Chet, who had distanced himself after Hal began working with Darius, showed up one day with a wary expression. "I've been thinking," Chet began, shuffling his feet awkwardly. "About Dad, about how he raised us. We grew up thinking hate was part of who we are." Hal nodded, his face serious. "And now?" Chet sighed. "And now I think maybe we were wrong. But it's hard to unlearn something that's been drilled into you." Darius, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "It starts with admitting it. And then it's about what you do next." The conversation wasn't easy, but it marked the beginning of a healing process that neither Hal nor Chet had thought possible. Months later, the Carson farm was thriving again, thanks to the efforts of the entire community. To celebrate, Hal and Darius organized a harvest festival, something Hollyfield hadn't seen in decades. The festival was held in the newly repaired barn, which had been transformed into a lively gathering place. Tables were piled high with food, music filled the air, and for the first time, people from both sides of town mingled freely. Darius stood by the entrance, watching as children played together, their laughter echoing through the night. Hal joined him, holding 2 glasses of sweet tea. "You ever think we'd see something like this?" Hal asked, handing one of the glasses to Darius. "Not in my lifetime," Darius admitted with a smile. "But here we are." As the night wore on, Hal stepped up to a makeshift stage, clearing his throat to get everyone's attention. "I don't have a lot of speeches in me," he began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But I just want to say thank you. To everyone who showed up, who helped, who believed this town could be better. This farm isn't just mine anymore, it's ours. And I hope it's a sign of what we can do when we stop tearing each other apart and start building something together." The applause was thunderous, and as Darius watched from the sidelines, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride in his town. The festival marked a turning point for Hollyfield. Conversations that had once been whispered in private were now being held openly. The local school board began addressing inequalities between black and white schools, and businesses started hiring more diverse employees. Hal and Darius became unlikely leaders in this new chapter for the town. They attended meetings, spoke at events, and even worked together to create a mentorship program for young boys, black and white, to teach them about leadership, respect, and the value of hard work. One day, as they walked through the fields together, Hal turned to Darius with a rare smile. "You know, I think my dad would have hated everything we've done here," he said with a chuckle. Darius laughed too. "Mine would have loved it." Hal nodded. "Then I guess we're doing something right." Years later, Hollyfield was a different town. The farm stood as a symbol of what was possible when people chose unity over division. Hal and Darius's names became synonymous with change, their story passed down as a lesson for future generations. A plaque was placed at the entrance to the farm, bearing the inscription, "In honor of Darius Walker and Hal Carson, who proved that even the deepest divides can be bridged." Darius lived to see the town he'd once resented become a place he was proud to call home. And when he passed, his children continued his work, ensuring that the lessons of Hollyfield were never forgotten. As for Hal, he spent the rest of his days quietly rebuilding his reputation, not as a Carson, but as a man who had chosen to change. Together, they had done the impossible. Thank you so much for watching this video and taking the time to explore this fascinating story with us. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us and God bless us all.